In the early morning hours of October the 7th, Israeli citizens were woken up by the sound of air raid sirens and the spectacle of thousands of rockets streaking across the sky, large numbers of which were being chased down and intercepted by the state-of-the-art Iron Dome air defense system. While this might be shocking to tourists or the outside perspective, through the years this has become commonplace to the average Israeli citizen and those familiar with local events. So common perhaps that the Iron Dome interceptor missiles streaking across the sky are almost a show of beauty, in a terrifying, deadly beauty sort of way. What was not such a common occurrence during the barrage, thousands of fighters belonging to the Hamas militant group and de facto rulers of the infamous Palestinian Gaza Strip began an intricate operation that successfully led to the breach of the most fortified and technologically sophisticated border in the world. In the hours after the missile attack and the all-out breach of the walls that effectively sealed in the open-air prison that is Gaza, militants managed to slaughter hundreds of unsuspecting Israeli soldiers, killed hundreds of Israeli citizens, and captured dozens of small and medium-sized settlements in the largest and deadliest surprise attack Israel has seen in 50 years. 2 weeks after the assault, and the situation has deteriorated to carpet bombings in the most densely populated city in the world, thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded, and a refugee count rapidly pushing the 1 million mark. It is truly shocking that all of these events could even take place in such a short time frame, and if you would like to know the details of what is happening, the internet is flooded with so many reports that I couldn't even possibly keep up with them. Since that is the case, I am going to focus on a different subject, the origins of the conflict. Hopefully by the end of this video you can walk away with an understanding of the Palestinian-Israeli feud and some of the nuance that is important to grasp in order to make a well-rounded conclusions on the topic. Fair warning, this video will likely irritate many on both sides, but I do not make it for those who are already decided on which side of the topic they are on. I also do not have time to speak on the entire history in such a short YouTube video, so please don't be upset when certain details are inevitably left out. So beware of the comment section, and let's go ahead and dive right in. The Israelis and Palestinians are two distinct groups of people that both claim the Middle East geographic region of Palestine is their ancestral homeland. Palestine is the southern strip of the greater coastal region of the Levant and is considered by the three Abrahamic religions as the Holy Land, and specifically referred to the Jews and Christians as the Promised Land. If you didn't already know, the Abrahamic religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, going from oldest to youngest, and are called Abrahamic religions because all three consider the historical figure of Abraham to be the first prophet of God. Hence, all the children of each religion descend from the same man. For the sake of relevancy, we are going to focus on the origin story of the Jews and the Islamic Arabs. Several terms will be thrown around, and I implore you to do some of your own research, but for clarity, terms such as Israelites, Hebrews, or Zionists refer to the Jewish peoples in various different forms, and labels such as Islamic, Arab, Muslim, and Bedouin are in reference to Palestinians in various different contexts. I originally wrote this script and went deep into the depth of Hebrew and Arab history pre-1900, but the video in its entirety would have been nearly an hour, so in the interest of time, I am giving a dramatically shorter outline of those events, but I do still have the materials, and if this is something the audience wants, then I will make a separate video in the future. A shortened version of the story begins in the late 1800s to early 1900s when the Ottoman Empire ruled over the territory of Palestine. During this time period, Palestine was almost entirely Arab-speaking, but there were small minorities of Christians and Jews that lived in the territory, mainly in the holy city of Jerusalem, where they lived in peace with one another. Europe in the time before the World Wars was becoming increasingly unwelcome for Jewish people. In that environment, the idea was born that Jews needed to leave Europe and found their own state. This was the birth of Zionism, or Jewish nationalism. The turmoil began during the First World War when the the then British Empire was fighting against the Ottomans and was looking to spark rebellion throughout the Middle East. The British Empire offered generous post-war deals with several different parties, which all agreed to rise up against the Ottomans. The British promised the Hashemites, which were the keepers of the holy sites of Mecca and Medina, that they would be granted an Arab state encompassing the entirety of the Arabian Peninsula, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. A similar promise was made to a tribe of desert bandits called the Saud. That they would be granted the territory today known as Saudi Arabia. These two promises conflicted with a deal the British and French had struck together to divide the Middle East amongst themselves. Outside of the Saud, all parties were deceived, and the British and French mandates would be established over the territories after the war. Specifically for the Jews, the British government made a proclamation in 1917 that a national home for Jewish people should be established in Palestine. This won over support of the Jews before the war ended. Token moves were made to placate the infuriated Hashemites after the war, such as making the Hashemite prince the de facto ruler of the region the British named Transjordan. And later his kin were positioned as ceremonial monarchs over Syria and Iraq, but still the entire region remained under the British rule. In the interwar period, animosity began to swell between the rapidly growing immigrant Jewish population and the local Muslims. During World War II, the region was relatively peaceful in the context of the global conflict, but there was a number of religious riots that led to the massacre of many Jews and subsequently many Muslims when the riots were brutally put down by the British occupation forces. Although it has been a common belief among Arabs that they largely blame the British Empire for helping to orchestrate the eventual Jewish takeover and the creation of the State of Israel, this is a common misconception, at least partially. At some point in the situation, the British decided to walk back their efforts to create a Jewish state. Based on new British political interests in the Middle East, although sympathetic to the Jews, the British actually favored the Arabs in hopes of good relations to further their business interests, likely due to the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia in 1938. At the end of World War II, the British imposed a blockade on Palestine to prevent the further arrival of Jews flooding into the region from Europe. The British announced that they would withdraw in the summer of 1948, and the fate of Palestine was put to a vote on the now infamous UN partition plan in late 1947. Briefly going over the plan to recognize its controversial nature and some nuance, the plan was to divide Palestine into 3 Jewish and 3 Arab enclaves. The Jews would receive the largely landlocked Galilee, the coastal plain from Haifa down to Ashdod, and then the majority of the Negev desert. The Arabs would have a northern coastal enclave of Acre, which is a historic city or port city, the West Bank of central Palestine, containing historic sites such as Nablus, Jericho, Jerusalem, and Ramallah, and another coastal enclave at Gaza with a much smaller piece of the Negev desert. The city of Jerusalem itself, and including the city of Bethlehem, sitting in the middle of the Palestinian West Bank, would be under the direct governance of the UN and would be an international zone supposedly open to the world for pilgrimage like it was for many years throughout history. There was a population imbalance of 32% Jews and 68% Arabs throughout the territory of Palestine, but the partition plan granted the Jews 56% of the total territory. The Jewish territories contained 500,000 Jewish people and 438,000 Arabs, while the Arab territories contained 818,000 Arabs and only 10,000 Jews. While Arabs themselves would have been more likely to accept a more even land distribution, powerful Arab leaders, both inside Palestine and at the heads of the Arab states around the world, rejected any partition deal whatsoever and demanded the entire territory be returned to the Palestinians. The refusal to budge on the issue on the Arab side and the proclamation from the Jewish leaders that the proposed deal was the minimum that they would accept. It is important to note that the Negev Desert, which made up the vast majority of proposed Jewish land under the partition, was completely worthless real estate and mostly devoid of people. The few tribesmen who did live nomadic desert lifestyles and in those that lived in the main population center of Beersheba were overwhelmingly Arab and estimated between 70 and 90,000 people, with less than 10,000 being Jews. When it comes to the plan itself, it is notable that under the UN partition plan, all Arabs within the Jewish state and the 10,000 Jews within the Arab state would become citizens of the state they lived in, and of the population of Jerusalem, split equally with 100,000 Jews and 100,000 Arabs. Residents of the city would get to choose which state they wanted citizenship in and could travel freely between that state territory and the territory of the Holy City. This seems to be one of many mistakes made on behalf of the global Arab leaders at the time, which, on top of demanding the entirety of Palestine be placed in under Arab rule, also claimed that once this was the case, no Jews that entered Palestine after the beginning of the British Mandate would be granted citizenship, which was the lion's share of Jews inside the country. The reality of the partition plan was that a new proposal with reduced Jewish territory would have lost both Jewish and international support and would not have garnered Arab support. Minor changes were made, however, like the city of Jaffa being made a fourth small enclave for the Palestinians, which the Jews reluctantly agreed to, but the refusal of either side to budge further led to a UN vote on the plan as it was, which passed 33-13 with a 2/3 majority vote in favor. The US and Soviet Union both voted for, while the most notable no outside of the Arab states was India, which made claims that bribery offers and death threats to the Indian Prime Minister and his sister, who was the UN ambassador, was their primary motivation to vote against. But India was likely already leaning no in the interest of stability because of a sizable Muslim minority within the country. The Palestinian Civil War broke out in 1948 after the Jewish Declaration of Independence and establishment of the State of Israel. The entire immediate neighborhood of Muslim nations would form the Palestinian Liberation Army and declare war on Israel, which ultimately prevailed in one of the most unexpected and miraculous underdog victories in the history of warfare. A number of factors contributed to the Muslim defeat, but the primary cause is likely poor diplomatic strategy and disunity among the Arab leaders. It was clear even to the Palestinian Arabs at the time that each Arab national leader was pushing the Arab world into the war for their own selfish reasons. King Abdullah of Jordan, for example, originally was in favor of the partition when he believed he could personally annex Arab Palestine into Jordan. The Palestinian Arab Mufti, or de facto leader Hajj Amin al-Husseini, also had expressed support for the partition because he believed he would become the ruler of the independent Palestine, but both publicly flipped to the other side when they felt the political tide turning. Egypt, which bordered Palestine to the south, was the most populous Arab country and de facto leader in the Muslim world, sought to capture all of Palestine for themselves, and Syria, which bordered Palestine to the north, believed that Palestine was geographically part of the larger Syrian region. Iraq, ruled by the Hashemite kin of the Jordanian king, supported Jordanian efforts to annex all of Palestine, and Saudi Arabia likely played all sides. The Sauds came to power through chaos, so why not have a little more?
Chaos. A gaping pit waiting to swallow us all.
Chaos isn't a pit. Chaos is a ladder.
Many Palestinian Arabs were expelled from the Jewish state in the ensuing chaos, but around 130,000 remained and either supported the Jews or stayed out of their way. Arab Palestinians outside the borders of the Jewish state had the numbers locally to turn the tide for the Arab armies, but due to the politics of the situation, there were mass refusals to fight. Israeli military accounts of the situation claim that it was discovered that when the Jewish forces went on the offensive, the Arab forces swelled in numbers. This is because when encroaching populated Arab territories, Arab villagers would join the army to protect their particular village. But when the Arabs ordered the offensives into the Jewish state, many local Palestinians outright refused to fight and often returned home. This was likely a demoralizing reality for Egyptian and Syrian troops fighting in a foreign land for their brethren who did not wish to fight for it themselves. By the end of the war, the Israeli state had won its independence and secured far more territory than it would have been granted by the UN partition. Gaza was annexed into Egypt, and the West Bank was annexed into Jordan. Over 700,000 Arabs would be expelled from Israel during the course of the war and would form a forever refugee community. Jewish communities living in Muslim-majority countries across the Middle East would be expelled in response and moved to Israel along with new waves of Jewish refugees from Europe. In 1967, once again, Israel would go to war with its neighbors of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. After UN peacekeeping forces are removed from the Sinai Peninsula and a subsequent Egyptian military buildup on the Egyptian-Israeli border, Israel declares war and preemptively strikes Egypt, decimating its larger air force on the ground. Armies clash, and in the ensuing chaos, the Egyptian defense minister panics and orders a withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. A disorderly withdrawal ensues. Egyptian forces, disorganized and routed, are massacred, and Israel begins its occupation of the Sinai Peninsula. On other fronts, Israel would attempt to negotiate peace, but a miscommunication between the Arab states makes Jordan and Syria unaware of the Egyptian defeat. Both attack Israel and are defeated in detail. Israel would occupy the West Bank from Jordan and the Golan Heights from Syria and sign an armistice just 6 days after the fighting began. In less than a week, Israel would triple its territory in yet another historically lopsided victory, and 1 million new Arabs would fall under Israeli rule. This conflict is known as the Six-Day War. In the years after this conflict, Jewish settlement of the West Bank and Gaza began. In 1973, on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack and invade Israel. With many soldiers and government officials on holiday, Israel would fail to repulse the attack. The United States, who had been giving Israel some support, sent emergency shipments of weapons to Israel that would prove the decisive edge in the fighting. Although a ceasefire is achieved and the borders would remain unchanged, oil exporting Arab countries would punish the U.S. for its part in the conflict by raising prices and issuing trade embargoes. This resulted in Israel ceding the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in order to placate the international community and end the global oil crisis. In 1980, Israel would proclaim Jerusalem as their capital, and this would kick off a domino effect of events. Palestinians, insulted by the proclamation and also egged on by uneven distribution of water in the West Bank, launched the first Intifada, or uprising, in 1987. This is followed up by the creation of Hamas, the terrorist group responsible for many attacks on Israel through the years, including the recent incursion from Gaza. The Palestinian Liberation Organization also declares independence of the Palestinian state from a conference in Algiers, and also names Jerusalem as its capital. 136 countries around the world would recognize Palestine as an independent nation under Israeli occupation. In 1993, peace talks make a breakthrough and the Oslo Agreements are signed. Initially, the deal recognizes both Israel and Palestine as independent states and introduces autonomy to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank city of Jericho. Further talks to grant autonomy to the two West Bank Palestinian settlements fall through. By 2000, the violence begins after an Israeli politician visits the Temple Mount, which is considered by Muslims as the third holiest site in all of Islam. It is important to note that the Temple Mount, the former site of Solomon's temple, is also the holiest site in all of Judaism. Access to the site would be a constant source of violence from both sides. This visit triggers the Second Intifada, which is far more violent and leads to many Israeli and Palestinian deaths. A wall is constructed around the West Bank to protect Israel, but encroaches on the borders of the occupied West Bank, and land on the Israeli side of the wall is rightfully seen by many as an illegal annexation. In order to calm the situation, in 2006, Israel withdraws its troops and all Jewish settlements from Gaza. This would be the second time since the last Israeli expansion during the Six-Day War that Israel would peacefully withdraw from occupied territory. However, the situation would continue to be tense as Hamas rapidly takes power in Gaza. Israel blockades Gaza and Hamas begins to regularly fire rockets into Israeli territory. In 2014, the last major flash in the conflict before modern times would begin. The Israeli Air Force hammers Gaza and destroys schools, 50,000 homes, and the only power plant in the region. Several smaller riots and clashes would take place, including several Israeli military operations against Gaza during 2020. There would not be another major flare-up in the conflict until October 7th, 2023, 2 weeks earlier from today. So that is the history of the conflict roughly over the last 120 years. I intentionally left out my opinions and the modern politics, as reporting on them takes away from the historical and factual information. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you would like to see more on this topic, please hit the like button and send this video beyond 3,000 likes. That is all from me until next time.